What if the HOA that controls your neighborhood doesn't have the power they claim? The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the calm lake water as 3 police cars pulled up to my cabin. My 8-year-old daughter Emily grabbed my hand, her eyes wide with fear. "Daddy, are they here to arrest us?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I squeezed her hand gently, my jaw clenching as I watched the HOA president march toward the officers with a thick folder of papers, her face twisted with vindictive satisfaction. She pointed directly at me, her voice carrying across the evening air. "That's him, officers. The one who's been illegally building structures and destroying our peaceful community." What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had been waiting for this moment for months. The folder in my study contained documents that would change everything. But first, let me tell you how we got here, because this story begins with grief, a desperate search for peace, and one woman's obsession with control that would ultimately. 6 months earlier, I stood in the doorway of our Chicago apartment, watching the movers carry away the last remnants of the life Sarah and I had built together. The cancer had taken her so quickly that even now, 3 months later, I still caught myself setting 2 coffee cups in the morning or saving funny stories to tell her when she got home from work. Emily sat on the bare hardwood floor, clutching her mother's favorite scarf, a silk blue one that still carried the faint scent of Sarah's perfume. At 8 years old, she had already learned that life could be cruel and unpredictable. The vibrant, laughing child she had been was now replaced by a quiet, withdrawn little girl who flinched at loud noises and rarely smiled. "Daddy, do we really have to leave?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I knelt beside her, brushing a strand of brown hair from her face. "Remember the stories Grandpa Joe used to tell about the cabin by the lake? About how he and Grandma would spend their summers there, watching the sunrise over the water?" She nodded slowly. "Well, that cabin is ours now. And I think Mom would want us to go there. To find some peace." The cabin in Brookstone Valley had been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather had built it in 1952 as a summer retreat, a place where the Harris family could escape the pressures of city life. My father had maintained it lovingly, adding a screened porch and updating the kitchen in the 1980s. After his death 5 years ago, the property had sat largely unused, visited only during brief weekend trips that became increasingly rare as Sarah's illness progressed. Now, it represented something different, a chance to start over, to give Emily the kind of childhood her mother would have wanted for her. A childhood filled with nature, fresh air, and the simple pleasures of small-town life. The drive to Brookstone Valley took us through winding mountain roads lined with ancient oak trees and rolling meadows dotted with wildflowers. Emily pressed her face against the window, and for the first time in months, I saw a spark of curiosity in her eyes. "Look, Daddy, there's a deer." I smiled, feeling something loosen in my chest. "There'll be lots of deer where we're going, sweetheart. And maybe some rabbits and certainly plenty of fish in the lake." Brookstone Valley appeared around a bend like something from a postcard. The small town was nestled in a valley between 2 gentle hills, with the lake stretching out like a mirror reflecting the afternoon sky. Victorian houses with wraparound porches lined the main street, their gardens bursting with summer flowers. A small marina housed a collection of sailboats and fishing vessels, and I could see families walking along the waterfront, children running ahead of their parents with ice cream cones. "It's beautiful," Emily breathed, and I heard an echo of her mother's voice in those words. Our cabin sat on a secluded cove about a mile from the main town. The gravel driveway wound through a grove of birch trees before opening onto a clearing where the log cabin stood, its stone chimney reaching toward the sky. The structure was solid and well-maintained, with a wide front porch that faced the lake and floor-to-ceiling windows that would flood the interior with natural light. But it was the lake that truly took my breath away. The water was crystal clear, so transparent that I could see fish swimming near the rocky bottom 20 feet from shore. A wooden dock extended into the water, its weathered planks worn smooth by decades of use. This dock had been here since my grandfather's time, grandfathered in before any modern regulations. "Can we go swimming?" Emily asked, already reaching for the car door handle. "After we get settled in," I promised, grabbing our suitcases from the trunk. The cabin's interior was exactly as I remembered from childhood visits. Knotty pine walls, a stone fireplace large enough to roast marshmallows, and windows that framed the lake like living paintings. Emily ran from room to room, exploring every nook and cranny, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. "This is my room," she called from the loft bedroom, which offered a perfect view of the lake through a dormer window. I smiled, carrying her suitcase up the narrow staircase. "Good choice, kiddo." That evening we sat on the dock with our feet dangling in the warm water, sharing a pizza I'd ordered from the one restaurant in town that delivered. Emily had changed into her swimsuit and spent an hour splashing in the shallow water near the shore, her laughter echoing across the cove for the first time since her mother's death. "I like it here," she said, leaning against my shoulder as we watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." Our peaceful existence lasted exactly 3 days. I was in the kitchen making breakfast when I heard the sharp rap of knuckles on our front door. Emily was still sleeping upstairs, exhausted from another day of swimming and exploring, so I quickly made my way to the entrance, hoping to keep the visitor from waking her. The woman standing on my porch was probably in her late 50s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp blue eyes that seemed to catalog every imperfection in my appearance. She wore a crisp white blouse and navy slacks, and carried a clipboard with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mr. Harris, I presume?" Her voice was clipped and efficient, like a teacher addressing a problematic student. "That's right. Can I help you?" She straightened her shoulders. "I'm Margaret Whitmore, president of the Brookstone Valley Homeowners Association. I'm here to welcome you to our community and ensure you understand our rules and regulations." I gestured toward the porch chairs. "Would you like to sit down? I could make some coffee. This won't take long." She remained standing, consulting her clipboard. "I've noticed you've been using the dock for recreational activities. I need to inform you that all waterfront activities must be approved by the HOA board, and there are specific hours when swimming and other water sports are permitted." I blinked, certain I'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "The dock usage," she repeated as if speaking to a slow child. "It's clearly outlined in Section 4.2 of our community guidelines. Waterfront activities are restricted to the hours of 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., and only with proper supervision and safety equipment. Mrs. Whitmore, I think there might be some confusion. This is my family's private dock. It's been here for 70 years. Her laugh was sharp and humorless. "Mr. Harris, I understand you're new to community living, but all waterfront areas in Brookstone Valley fall under HOA jurisdiction. We have regulations for a reason, to maintain property values and ensure everyone's safety and enjoyment." I felt my jaw tighten. "Ma'am, with respect, this dock is on my property. It was built by my grandfather in 1952, long before any HOA existed." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "The Brookstone Valley HOA was established in 1987 and has jurisdiction over all properties within our designated boundaries. Your cabin falls within those boundaries. I have the maps right here." She produced a laminated sheet from her clipboard, pointing to a section highlighted in yellow. "As you can see, your property line extends to the water's edge, but the dock itself is considered a common area structure." I studied the map, my confusion growing. "This doesn't make sense. My family has owned this land for generations." "Mr. Harris, I understand this might be overwhelming, but ignorance of the rules is not an excuse for breaking them. I'm willing to overlook the past 3 days of unauthorized dock usage, but going forward, you'll need to submit a request form for any waterfront activities." She handed me a thick packet of papers. "This contains all our community guidelines, architectural review procedures, and violation protocols. Please read through it carefully. We pride ourselves on maintaining the highest standards in Brookstone Valley." I flipped through the packet, my disbelief growing with each page. Restrictions on exterior paint colors, mandatory approval for any structure over 4 feet tall, noise ordinances that prohibited children from playing outdoors before 9 a.m. or after 7 p.m., and a comprehensive list of approved landscaping plants. "Mrs. Whitmore, I moved here for peace and quiet, not to live under someone else's rules." Her smile was thin and cold. "Mr. Harris, rules are what separate civilization from chaos. They're what make Brookstone Valley the desirable community it is today. I'm sure once you've had time to acclimate, you'll appreciate the stability and order we provide." She turned to leave, then paused at the porch steps. "Oh, and Mr. Harris? I noticed your grass is getting a bit long. Our landscaping standards require lawns to be maintained at no more than 3 inches in height. You'll want to address that before our next inspection." I watched her walk away, her posture rigid with self-importance. Through the window, I could see Emily stirring in her bed, and I felt a surge of protective anger. We had come here to heal, to find peace after the worst year of our lives, and this woman was already trying to control how we lived. I poured myself a second cup of coffee and sat on the porch, studying the HOA packet. The more I read, the more incredulous I became. There were restrictions on everything, from the type of flowers I could plant to the color of my window treatments. There were mandatory participation requirements for community events and detailed protocols for filing complaints against neighbors. But it was the waterfront regulations that truly caught my attention. According to the HOA guidelines, any structure within 50 feet of the water required board approval and annual inspections. Violations could result in fines of up to $500 per day, and the HOA had the authority to remove non-compliant structures at the owner's expense. I thought about my grandfather who had built this dock with his own hands, spending weeks that summer of 1952 laying each board and driving every nail. The dock wasn't just a structure, it was part of our family history, a place where 3 generations of Harris men had taught their children to fish, to swim, to appreciate the simple beauty of life on the water. No clipboard-wielding bureaucrat was going to take that away from us. That afternoon, while Emily napped, I drove into town to visit the county clerk's office. The building was a small brick structure on Main Street, sandwiched between a hardware store and a family restaurant. The clerk, a friendly woman named Mrs. Patterson, greeted me with the kind of smile that made me remember why I'd always loved small towns. "What can I help you with, hon?" "I'd like to look up property records for the Harris cabin on Lakeshore Drive." She led me to a computer terminal in the corner of the office. "You just moved in, didn't you? I heard Margaret Whitmore was already making her rounds." I looked up from the screen. "You know Mrs. Whitmore?" Mrs. Patterson rolled her eyes. "Everyone in town knows Margaret. She's been HOA president for 15 years and she takes the job very seriously. Too seriously if you ask me." "What do you mean?" She glanced around the office then leaned closer. "Look, I probably shouldn't be saying this, but Margaret has a way of interpreting the rules to fit her preferences. She's driven out 3 families in the past 5 years with her constant violations and fines. Nice people too. Just couldn't handle the harassment." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What kind of harassment?" "Oh, you know, surprise inspections, complaints about every little thing, threats of legal action. She actually took the Johnsons to court over a bird feeder. Said it was an unauthorized structure. Can you believe that?" I turned back to the computer, my determination growing. The property records loaded slowly, but what I saw made my heart race. The Harris family had indeed owned the land continuously since 1951, when my grandfather purchased it from the original homesteader. The property boundaries were clearly marked, and they included not just the cabin and immediate grounds, but also the dock and a significant portion of the lake bottom. But there was more. As I scrolled through the documents, I discovered something that made my pulse quicken. Over the past 10 years, through a series of quiet purchases and strategic investments, I had been acquiring additional properties in the area. What had started as a way to preserve the natural beauty around my family's cabin had evolved into something much more significant. I owned the Morrison property to the east, purchased when the elderly couple decided to move to assisted living. I owned the vacant lot across the cove, bought from a developer who was struggling with environmental regulations. I owned the small island in the middle of the lake, acquired through a tax sale 3 years ago. In fact, as I traced the property lines on the detailed survey maps, I realized I owned nearly 60% of the land around the lake, including the entire shoreline of our cove and the underwater rights that extended well into the lake itself. But the most interesting discovery was yet to come. I clicked on the HOA incorporation documents, curious about the legal foundation of Margaret's authority. What I found made me smile for the first time since her visit. The Brookstone Valley HOA had been incorporated in 1987, as Margaret had said. But their authority was limited to a specific set of properties that had been part of the original Brookstone Valley subdivision. My family's cabin, having been built in 1952, predated the subdivision by 35 years and was specifically excluded from the HOA's jurisdiction. More importantly, the dock wasn't just grandfathered in, it was on land that had never been subject to any HOA authority. The water rights, the dock itself, and the entire shoreline were private property that the HOA had no legal right to regulate. I printed out the relevant documents and tucked them into a folder. Mrs. Patterson watched me with interest. "Find what you were looking for?" "More than I expected," I said, shaking her hand. "Thank you for your help." "Good luck with Margaret," she said with a knowing smile. "Something tells me you're going to need it." I decided to keep my discoveries to myself for now, curious to see how far Margaret would push her manufactured authority. I didn't have to wait long. The next morning, I was awakened by the sound of someone measuring our grass with a ruler. Through the bedroom window, I could see Margaret kneeling on our lawn, clipboard in hand, methodically documenting the height of our grass at various points around the property. Emily appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. "Daddy, why is that lady in our yard?" "Good question, sweetheart. Let's go find out. I threw on a robe and stepped onto the porch, Emily hiding behind my legs. Margaret looked up from her measurements, her expression stern. Mr. Harris, I'm conducting a routine property inspection. As I mentioned yesterday, your grass height is in violation of our community standards. Mrs. Whitmore, you're on my private property without permission. I need to ask you to leave. She stood, brushing dirt from her knees. Mr. Harris, the HOA has the right to inspect properties for compliance with our regulations. It's clearly stated in Section 7.3 of your HOA agreement. I never signed any HOA agreement. The agreement is part of your property deed. All residents are bound by our covenants, conditions, and restrictions. I felt Emily's grip tighten on my robe. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm going to ask you one more time to leave my property. Her face flushed red. Mr. Harris, I can see you're going to be a problem. Let me be clear. I've been managing this community for 15 years, and I will not allow one disgruntled newcomer to undermine our standards. You will cut your grass to the proper height by 5 p.m. today, or you will receive a violation notice and fine. And if I refuse? Then you'll discover that the HOA has significant legal authority to enforce our regulations. I've successfully removed non-compliant residents before, and I won't hesitate to do so again. She marched off, leaving me standing on the porch with a frightened 8-year-old clinging to my leg. Emily looked up at me with wide eyes. Daddy, can she really make us leave? I knelt down and hugged her. No, sweetheart. This is our home and no one can make us leave. But we need to be smart about how we handle this. That afternoon, I mowed the lawn, not because I felt obligated to comply with Margaret's rules, but because I wanted to keep the peace while I planned my next move. Emily helped by raking the grass clippings and we made a game of it, racing to see who could fill their bag fastest. But Margaret wasn't finished. Over the next week, she found a dozen new violations to cite. Our outdoor furniture was the wrong color for the community aesthetic. Emily's bike left on the porch was considered clutter. The bird feeder we'd hung from the oak tree was an unauthorized structure. Each violation came with a formal notice, typed on official HOA letterhead and hand-delivered to our door. Each notice included a fine, $50 for the furniture, $75 for the bike, $100 for the bird feeder. The fines were due within 30 days or they would double. I threw each notice into a growing pile on my kitchen counter, ignoring Margaret's increasingly frantic phone calls. Emily began to withdraw again, constantly looking over her shoulder when we played outside, afraid that the angry lady might appear. Daddy, why doesn't she like us? Emily asked one evening as we sat on the dock watching the sunset. I pulled her closer. Some people think that controlling others makes them important, sweetheart. But real strength comes from helping people, not hurting them. Like how Mommy used to help sick people get better? My throat tightened. Sarah had been a pediatric nurse, dedicating her life to caring for children. She would have been horrified by Margaret's treatment of Emily. Exactly like that, baby. The final straw came the following Saturday. I was in the garage, working on a project that would soon become the center of our conflict with Margaret. Emily was at the kitchen table working on a puzzle when I heard her scream. I ran outside to find Margaret standing in our yard, pointing a finger at Emily and shouting, "You cannot ride that bicycle on the common areas. The playground is for residents only, and your family has not paid their HOA dues." Emily was frozen on her bike, tears streaming down her face. She had been riding on the path that connected our property to the small playground near the lake, a path I had assumed was public. "Emily, come here," I called, and she immediately pedaled toward me, sobbing. I turned to Margaret, feeling my patience finally snap. "What is wrong with you? She's 8 years old. She's a non-compliant resident of a non-compliant household," Margaret snapped. "Until your family follows the rules, you don't get to use community amenities. The playground is for children in the neighborhood. Emily lives in the neighborhood." "Not until you pay your dues and fines," Margaret said, pulling out her phone. "I'm documenting this violation as well. Unauthorized use of common areas by a non-compliant resident." I watched her take photos of Emily, who was still crying, and something inside me hardened. This woman had crossed a line. She had made my daughter cry, traumatized a child who had already endured more loss than any 8-year-old should have to face. "Mrs. Whitmore," I said quietly, "I want you to leave my property and never come back." She looked up from her phone, surprised by my tone. "Excuse me? You heard me. Get off my land. Now." "Mr. Harris, I have every right to—" "No," I interrupted, my voice carrying across the water. "You don't. You have no authority here, no jurisdiction over my property, and no right to harass my daughter. Now. Margaret's face went white then red. Mr. Harris, you are making a very serious mistake. I have the full authority of the HOA behind me, and I will not tolerate this kind of insubordination. Insubordination. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Lady, I don't work for you. I don't answer to you. And I certainly don't owe you any respect after what you just did to my daughter. She backed toward her car, still holding her phone. You'll regret this, Mr. Harris. I promise you that. As she drove away, I knelt beside Emily and held her while she cried. I'm sorry, sweetheart. She had no right to yell at you like that. I just wanted to play on the swings, she whispered. I know, baby. And you have every right to play on those swings. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. That night, after Emily had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and began researching everything I could about HOA law, property rights, and the specific regulations governing our area. What I found confirmed my suspicions and gave me the ammunition I needed for the battle ahead. Margaret Whitmore had been operating under false authority for years, bullying residents with threats she had no legal right to make. The HOA's jurisdiction was limited to the original subdivision properties, and even then their authority was far more restricted than Margaret claimed. But I also knew that knowledge without strategy was useless. Margaret had 15 years of experience wielding power in this community, and she had allies among the other residents who had been conditioned to accept her authority without question. I needed to be smart about this. I needed to be patient. And I needed to build a boathouse. The next morning, I drove into town to visit Hanson's Hardware, a family-owned store that had been serving Brookstone Valley for 3 generations. The owner, Bill Hanson, was a man in his 60s with calloused hands and a knowing smile. You're the new guy at the Harris place, he said, not making it a question. That's right. I'm Max Harris. Bill Hanson. I knew your grandfather. Hell of a man. Built that dock himself, didn't he? I nodded. I'm thinking about building a small boathouse. Just something to store a couple of kayaks and some fishing gear. Bill's expression darkened. You talked to Margaret about that? No, and I don't plan to. He studied my face for a long moment, then smiled. Good for you. Your grandfather would have liked that. He never did cotton to people telling him what to do on his own land. Bill helped me select the materials I needed, pressure-treated lumber, galvanized hardware, and a simple roof design that would complement the rustic aesthetic of the existing dock. As we loaded my truck, he offered some unsolicited advice. Margaret's got a lot of people scared around here, he said, hefting a bundle of 2x4s. But fear only works if you let it. Your grandfather understood that. What do you mean? Joe Harris was one of the original property owners around the lake. He was here before the subdivision, before the HOA, before Margaret Whitmore was even a gleam in her daddy's eye. He never let anyone push him around, and he wouldn't want you to either. I shook Bill's hand. Thanks for the advice. Don't mention it. And Max, if you need anything else, you know where to find me. I started construction that afternoon, with Emily as my eager assistant. She held boards while I measured and cut, handed me nails and screws, and peppered me with questions about every step of the process. Why are we making the roof slope like that, Daddy? So the rain will run off instead of pooling on top. And why are we using those metal things? Those are joist hangers. They help support the weight of the roof. Working with my hands was therapeutic, a welcome distraction from the stress of Margaret's harassment. Emily's laughter as she helped reminded me why we had come here in the first place, to heal, to build something positive from the ashes of our grief. The boathouse was a simple structure, maybe 12 feet by 8 feet, with an open front facing the lake and a pitched roof that would shed rain and snow. It was designed to house 2 kayaks, some fishing equipment, and a small workbench. Nothing elaborate, nothing ostentatious, just a functional building that would serve our needs while complementing the natural beauty of the lakefront. On the 3rd day of construction, Margaret appeared. I was on the roof, securing the last of the shingles, when I heard her voice below. Mr. Harris, come down here immediately. I looked down to see her standing on the dock, clipboard in hand, her face flushed with anger. Emily was sitting on the bank, building a sandcastle, and she looked up nervously at Margaret's tone. What can I do for you, Mrs. Whitmore? You can stop this illegal construction immediately. This structure violates at least 6 HOA regulations, and I'm ordering you to cease all work pending a full review by the Architectural Committee. I climbed down the ladder, my patience already wearing thin. Mrs. Whitmore, I've told you before, your HOA has no jurisdiction over my property. That's where you're wrong, Mr. Harris. This structure is within 50 feet of the water, which makes it subject to our waterfront regulations. You should have submitted plans to the Architectural Review Committee before beginning construction. She pulled out her phone and began taking photos of the half-finished boathouse. I'm documenting this violation for our legal team. The fine for unauthorized construction is $500 per day, retroactive to the date construction began. I felt my temper flare. You're not documenting anything. You're trespassing on private property. Mr. Harris, I have the authority to inspect any structure that violates HOA regulations. This boathouse is clearly in violation of our setback requirements, height restrictions, and architectural guidelines. Emily looked up from her sandcastle, fear creeping into her eyes. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that my daughter was watching. Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to leave my property. Now. Not until you agree to stop this illegal construction. Then I'll call the police. Margaret's laugh was sharp and vindictive. Go ahead, Mr. Harris. Call them. I think you'll find that the law is on my side. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, never taking my eyes off Margaret's face. I'd like to report a trespasser on my property. Her smugness faltered slightly, but she held her ground. I'm not trespassing. I'm conducting an official HOA inspection. The dispatcher took my information and promised to send an officer. While we waited, Margaret continued to document the boathouse with her phone, muttering under her breath about non-compliant residents and legal action. Officer Bradley arrived 20 minutes later, a young man with kind eyes and a professional demeanor. He listened patiently as both Margaret and I explained our positions, taking notes in a small notebook. Mrs. Whitmore, he said finally, do you have any documentation that proves your HOA has jurisdiction over this property? Margaret produced her laminated map, pointing to the highlighted area. As you can see, officer, the Harris property falls within our designated boundaries. Officer Bradley studied the map, then looked at me. Mr. Harris, do you have any documentation regarding your property boundaries? I handed him a copy of the survey I'd obtained from the county clerk's office. He compared the two documents, his expression growing more serious. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm not seeing any legal authority for your HOA to regulate this property. The survey clearly shows that Mr. Harris owns the land where this structure is being built. Officer, I've been managing this community for 15 years. I know what properties fall under our jurisdiction. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave Mr. Harris's property. If you have a legal dispute regarding property boundaries or HOA authority, you'll need to resolve that through the courts. Margaret's face went white, then red. This is outrageous. I'm being denied the right to enforce legally binding regulations. Ma'am, please leave the property. After Margaret left, Officer Bradley lingered for a moment. Mr. Harris, I'd recommend you document everything. Photos, dates, witnesses. If she continues to harass you, don't hesitate to call us. I shook his hand. Thank you, officer. Beautiful boathouse, by the way. Your grandfather would be proud. That evening, as Emily and I grilled burgers on the porch, she asked the question I'd been dreading. Daddy, why is that lady so mean to us? I set down my spatula and knelt beside her chair. Some people think that power means controlling others, sweetheart. But real power comes from helping people, from building things that make life better. Like our boathouse? Exactly like our boathouse. And like how Mommy helped sick kids get better? My throat tightened. Your mom was the strongest person I ever knew, Em. And she would be so proud of how brave you've been through all this. Emily smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since Margaret's harassment began. Can we go kayaking tomorrow? As soon as I finish the boathouse. Promise. Promise. Margaret's retreat was only temporary. Over the next few days, she escalated her campaign with the persistence of someone who had never been truly challenged. The violations notices multiplied. Our outdoor grill was a fire hazard, Emily's chalk drawings on the driveway were property defacement, and our evening conversations on the porch violated the quiet hours ordinance. But the notices came with a new threat. Final notice was stamped across each one in red ink, followed by warnings about legal action and property liens. I continued to ignore them, focusing instead on finishing the boathouse. Emily and I worked together every morning, and by the end of the week we had created something beautiful. A simple, functional structure that looked like it had always been part of the waterfront. It's perfect, Daddy, Emily said as we stood on the dock, admiring our handiwork. We make a good team, I replied, ruffling her hair. But our moment of satisfaction was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching. Through the trees I could see a small convoy, Margaret's sedan, followed by 2 pickup trucks and a van marked Brookstone Valley HOA. "Emily, go inside," I said quietly. "But Daddy?" "Inside, sweetheart. Now." She reluctantly obeyed, watching from the kitchen window as Margaret emerged from her car with what appeared to be a small army. There were 5 people with her, 3 men in work clothes carrying tools, and a woman with a camera documenting everything. Margaret marched onto my property with the confidence of someone who believed she held all the cards. "Mr. Harris, I'm here with an official enforcement team. You have 30 seconds to vacate the premises before we begin demolition of your illegal structure." I stepped between them and the boathouse. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm warning you, do not touch my property. This structure is in violation of multiple HOA regulations. We have the authority to remove it at your expense." One of the men, a contractor I didn't recognize, stepped forward with a crowbar. "Sorry, buddy. Nothing personal. Just doing my job." "Your job is to destroy other people's property?" He shrugged. "Lady pays me to follow HOA orders. Says you're in violation." I pulled out my phone. "I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," Margaret said. "Officer Bradley already knows about this action. The HOA has full authority to remove non-compliant structures." But as I dialed, I noticed something that made me smile. In her eagerness to assert her authority, Margaret had made a critical error. She was documenting the entire confrontation, and her photographer was capturing every moment of what was about to become a very expensive mistake. Officer Bradley arrived within minutes, but this time he wasn't alone. Detective Sarah Chin, a serious-looking woman in her 40s, stepped out of the second patrol car. "Mrs. Whitmore," Officer Bradley said, "I thought we'd resolved this issue." "Officer, I've obtained legal authority for this enforcement action. The HOA has the right to remove structures that violate our regulations." Detective Chin stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'd like to see that legal authority." Margaret produced a folder thick with documents. "Court order, architectural violations and enforcement authorization. All properly filed and notarized." Detective Chin studied the documents for several minutes, her expression growing more serious. Finally, she looked up at Margaret. "Mrs. Whitmore, where exactly did you file these documents?" "With the county clerk's office as required by law." "Ma'am, I need to inform you that obtaining a court order requires appearing before a judge." Detective Chen's words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Margaret's confident demeanor faltered, her eyes narrowing as she clutched her folder tighter. "I assure you, Detective, everything is in order. The HOA has followed all proper procedures." Detective Chin flipped through the documents again, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Whitmore, these papers reference a court order, but there's no official stamp or judge's signature. You're claiming authority to demolish private property based on internal HOA documents and a filing with the county clerk that doesn't appear to have judicial backing." Margaret's face reddened, but she held her ground. "The HOA's authority is clearly outlined in our covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Mr. Harris's boathouse violates multiple regulations, and we have the right to enforce compliance." I stepped forward, keeping my voice calm but firm. "Detective, I have documentation that proves my property is exempt from HOA jurisdiction. The cabin, the dock, and the land it's built on predate the HOA by decades. Mrs. Whitmore has been trespassing and harassing my family for weeks." Detective Chin turned to me. "Can you show me those documents, Mr. Harris?" I nodded and retrieved the folder from my study, the one I'd prepared after my visit to the county clerk's office. I handed her the property survey, the original deed from 1951, and the HOA incorporation documents that explicitly excluded my family's land from their jurisdiction. As Detective Chin reviewed the paperwork, Margaret's photographer continued snapping photos, and the contractors stood awkwardly, their tools idle. Officer Bradley leaned toward me and whispered, "You've got her cornered, Max. Just stay calm." After a long silence, Detective Chin closed the folder and handed it back to me. "Mr. Harris, your documentation appears to be in order. This property, including the dock and the boathouse, is not subject to HOA oversight. Mrs. Whitmore, you and your team need to leave immediately. If you attempt to damage or remove any part of this structure, you'll be liable for trespassing and destruction of private property." Margaret's jaw dropped. "This is outrageous. I've been president of this HOA for 15 years. I know the rules better than anyone." "Then you should know," Detective Chin said coolly, "that misrepresenting a court order and attempting to demolish private property without legal authority is a serious offense. I suggest you consult a lawyer before taking further action." The contractors exchanged uneasy glances, clearly rethinking their involvement. The photographer lowered her camera, and Margaret's composure began to crack. "This isn't over, Mr. Harris," she hissed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You'll hear from our legal team." "I look forward to it," I replied, crossing my arms. "Now get off my land." Margaret stormed back to her car, her entourage trailing behind her. The pickup trucks and van pulled away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Officer Bradley tipped his hat to me. "You handled that well, Max. But she's not going to give up easily. Keep those documents handy." Detective Chin nodded. "If she comes back or escalates this further, call us immediately." "And Mr. Harris? That boathouse looks good. Solid work." As the officers drove away, Emily peeked out from the kitchen window, her face a mix of fear and relief. I waved her outside and she ran to me, wrapping her arms around my waist. "Is she gone, Daddy?" "For now, sweetheart," I said, hugging her tightly. "For now." That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunset reflect off the lake. Emily was inside, coloring a picture of the boathouse, her mood lighter than it had been in days. But I knew Margaret wasn't finished. Her pride had been wounded, and people like her didn't back down when challenged, they doubled down. I opened my laptop and began drafting an email to a lawyer friend in Chicago, attaching copies of all my property documents. If Margaret wanted a legal fight, I'd be ready. But I also knew this wasn't just about me and Emily anymore. Margaret's reign of terror had affected other families in Brookstone Valley, and if I was going to take her down, I needed allies. The next morning, I drove into town and stopped by Hanson's Hardware. Bill was behind the counter, polishing a display of fishing lures. "Heard you had some excitement out at your place yesterday," he said with a grin. "Word travels fast," I replied. "Small town, Max. So, what's your next move?" I leaned against the counter. "I need to know who else Margaret's been bullying. If I'm going to fight her, I can't do it alone." Bill nodded thoughtfully. "You should talk to the Thompsons on Pine Street. Margaret fined them $2,000 last year over a pergola they built in their backyard. And the Garcias, nice family, moved out 2 years ago after she took them to court over a fence. Then there's Mrs. Patterson at the county clerk's office. She's got no love for Margaret either." "Thanks, Bill. I'll start there." As I left the hardware store, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since Sarah's death. This wasn't just about protecting my family's legacy, it was about standing up for a community that had been living under Margaret's thumb for too long. Over the next week, I reached out to the families Bill had mentioned, along with a few others I'd heard about through Mrs. Patterson. The Thompsons invited me over for coffee, where they shared stories of Margaret's relentless inspections and fines that had nearly bankrupted them. The Garcias, who I contacted by phone, described how Margaret's legal threats had forced them to sell their home at a loss. Each conversation revealed the same pattern. Margaret used her position to intimidate and control, wielding the HOA's rules like a weapon. I also learned something else. Margaret's influence extended beyond the HOA. She had connections in the county planning office, which explained why her filings often went unchallenged. But those connections wouldn't help her now. Armed with my property records and the support of other residents, I was ready to take the fight to her. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived, summoning me to an emergency HOA board meeting to address ongoing violations at my property. The letter, signed by Margaret, demanded my attendance and warned that failure to comply could result in further legal action. I smiled as I read it. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The meeting was held in the community center, a modest building near the marina. About 30 residents attended, most of them looking nervous or resigned. Margaret sat at the head of a long table, flanked by 2 other board members who seemed more like her lackeys than independent voices. Her clipboard was in front of her, and she wore the same self-assured expression she'd had on my porch that first day. As I entered with Emily by my side, whispers rippled through the room. I carried my folder of documents, along with a few extra copies I'd prepared for distribution. Margaret's eyes narrowed when she saw me, but she quickly regained her composure. "Mr. Harris," she began, her voice dripping with authority, "you've been summoned to address multiple violations, including unauthorized construction, failure to pay fines, and non-compliance with community standards. Do you have anything to say before we proceed with enforcement actions?" I stood, addressing the room rather than Margaret directly. "I do. But first, I'd like to clarify a few things for everyone here. My family's property, including the dock and the boathouse, is not subject to HOA jurisdiction. It predates the HOA by 35 years, and I have the documentation to prove it. I handed copies of the property survey and deed to the residents seated closest to me, who passed them around. Murmurs grew louder as people read the documents, some nodding in surprise. Margaret banged her gavel. "Mr. Harris, this is not the time for theatrics. Your property is within our boundaries and you are subject to our rules." "That's where you're wrong," I said, holding up the HOA incorporation documents. "These papers, filed in 1987, explicitly exclude my family's land from your jurisdiction. You've been harassing me and my daughter for weeks, citing rules that don't apply to us." Margaret's face flushed, but she pressed on. "Even if your land is exempt, the boathouse is within 50 feet of the water, which falls under our waterfront regulations." "No," I said firmly. "I own the shoreline and the lake bottom in that cove. In fact, I own 60% of the land around this lake, including the underwater rights. Your regulations don't apply to my property and they never have." The room erupted in gasps and whispers. Margaret's composure cracked, her hands trembling as she gripped her clipboard. "That's preposterous. You can't own the lake." "I don't own the lake," I said calmly. "But I do own the permits that allow this community to access it. Every dock, every marina slip, every waterfront amenity in Brookstone Valley operates under permits tied to my family's original land grant. Permits I've kept current through my property holdings." I pulled out another document, this one a detailed record of the water rights and permits tied to my properties. "Without my approval, those permits can be revoked. Which means every dock in this community, including yours, Mrs. Whitmore, could be deemed illegal overnight." The room fell silent. Margaret's allies on the board looked at each other, clearly unprepared for this revelation. The other residents leaned forward, hanging on my every word. "And one more thing," I continued, my voice steady but forceful. 4 years you've bullied this community with fines, threats, and lawsuits. You've driven families out of their homes, all while claiming authority you don't legally have. I've spoken to the Thompsons, the Garcias, and others who've suffered under your rules. They're ready to testify if this goes to court." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time she looked genuinely rattled. Mr. Thompson stood up, his voice shaking but resolute. "Max is right. Margaret fined us thousands over a pergola that was on our private property. She threatened to foreclose on our home if we didn't comply." Mrs. Garcia, who had driven in from out of town after I'd contacted her, stood next. "She forced us to sell our house because we couldn't afford the legal fees to fight her. We loved Brookstone Valley, but Margaret made it impossible to stay." One by one, other residents stood, sharing their stories of Margaret's overreach. The room buzzed with anger and solidarity, a community finally finding its voice. Detective Chin, who had quietly slipped into the back of the room during my speech, stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've reviewed Mr. Harris's documents and they're legitimate. I'm also aware of multiple complaints filed against you with the county. If these allegations of harassment and misrepresentation are substantiated, you could face serious legal consequences." Margaret's face went pale. "This is absurd. I've dedicated my life to this community." "You've dedicated your life to controlling it," I said. "And that ends tonight." I turned to the residents. "I propose we hold a vote to dissolve the current HOA board and elect new leadership. People who will respect property rights and treat this community like neighbors, not subjects." The motion passed overwhelmingly, with only Margaret and her 2 board allies voting against it. By the end of the night, a new interim board was formed, with Mr. Thompson as president and Mrs. Patterson as secretary. Margaret was removed from her position, her clipboard left abandoned on the table. As the meeting adjourned, residents approached me, shaking my hand and thanking me for standing up to Margaret. Emily, who had been sitting quietly in the back, ran to me and hugged my legs. "You did it, Daddy," she whispered. "We did it," I corrected, lifting her into my arms. "This is our home and no one's going to take it from us." The next day, I received a call from my lawyer friend in Chicago. He'd reviewed the documents and confirmed that Margaret's actions constituted harassment and possibly fraud. He was preparing a civil suit against her on behalf of me and the other affected families, with the county prosecutor considering criminal charges based on her falsified court order claims. Margaret moved out of Brookstone Valley a week later, her house listed for sale before the legal proceedings could fully unfold. The new HOA board, under Mr. Thompson's leadership, rewrote the community guidelines to focus on cooperation and fairness, ensuring that no one would face the kind of harassment Emily and I had endured. That summer, Emily and I spent every morning on the lake, kayaking from our boathouse and fishing off the dock my grandfather had built. Her laughter echoed across the water, a sound that felt like healing, like hope. We hung a new bird feeder in the oak tree, painted the outdoor furniture bright blue, Sarah's favorite color, and let the grass grow just a little longer than 3 inches. One evening, as we sat on the dock watching the sunset, Emily turned to me with a serious expression. "Daddy, do you think Mommy would like it here?" I pulled her close, my heart full. "I know she would, sweetheart. This is exactly the kind of place she'd want us to be, together, happy and free." And as the last rays of sunlight danced across the lake, I felt Sarah's presence in the breeze, in the warmth of Emily's hand in mine, and in the quiet certainty that we had found our peace at last.